Hi, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we are diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute.
There are certain sounds in that old brownstone on West 35th Street that tell you what kind of day it's going to be before you've had your first cup of coffee. The particular clink of Fritz's spoon against the good china means Wolfe is in an amenable mood. The absence of any sound at all from the office at 11:02 in the morning, with the elevator's whir just fading from the shaft above, means he is exactly on schedule and exactly as pleased with the world as a man who spends 4 hours a day fondling orchids can be expected to be. What it does not usually mean is that a woman in a mink stole 3 sizes too warm for late September is sitting in the red leather chair, wringing a handkerchief like she meant to strangle it. I'd let her in 20 minutes earlier. Her name was Constance Harmon Vale, she said, and she needed to see Nero Wolfe, and she said it in the tone of someone who had never in her life needed to see anyone, and found the experience mortifying. I put her in the office, told her Mr. Wolfe would be down at 11, and went back to my desk to finish transcribing germination notes, which is about as far from detective work as filing your nails, but it pays the bills. At 11:03 the door opened and Wolfe came in, 1/7 of a ton of him, and crossed to the chair behind his desk with the kind of unhurried dignity you'd expect from a man who considers walking an imposition on his dignity generally. He nodded at Mrs. Vale, not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgment that she existed, and had apparently been vouched for by the fact that she was sitting in his office, and lowered himself into the chair built to hold him. "Madam," he said, "Archie tells me you require assistance. I should tell you at the outset that I am not available for divorce work, for surveillance of an errant husband, or for the recovery of a lost cat. If your business falls into any of those categories, Mr. Goodwin can recommend an agency perfectly suited to it." She didn't blink. Give her credit for that. "My husband is dead, Mr. Wolfe. 3 days ago. Someone put arsenic in his brandy." That got a flicker out of him. Not much, just the faint contraction around the eyes he does instead of raising his eyebrows, because raising his eyebrows would require more muscular effort than he generally cares to expend for a mere client. "The police, I presume, are aware of this." "The police," she said, "have arrested my husband's business partner, Everett Cray. They found arsenic in his desk drawer at the office, and a life insurance policy naming Everett as beneficiary if my husband died before the partnership dissolved. And that's apparently enough for Inspector Kramer to call it solved and go back to his lunch." Her voice had a crack in it now, thin as a hairline fracture in good porcelain. "But it wasn't Everett, Mr. Wolfe. Everett Cray has been my husband's friend for 30 years. He was at our house for dinner 2 nights before Julian died, and he made a full toast about their 40th year in business together. And men don't do that and then go poison you for insurance money." I was taking this down in my head, the way I do, and thinking that grief does peculiar things to a woman's logic. Because in my experience, men do exactly that, all the time, with a toast in one hand and arsenic in the other pocket. But I kept it to myself, and watched Wolfe's face, which had settled into the particular blankness that means he's already decided he doesn't want the case, and is trying to work out how to refuse it without seeming discourteous, which for Wolfe is a full-time occupation. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "I sympathize with your position, but I have no quarrel with the New York Police Department's competence in matters of arsenic and desk drawers. If you believe Mr. Cray innocent, the appropriate recourse is a competent defense attorney, not a private investigator with, I might add, considerable fees." "I can pay your fees." She said it flatly, the way you say something you've said 100 times to yourself in a mirror to make sure it'll hold up. "Julian left me comfortable. The issue is that in 6 weeks, Everett Cray is going to be tried for murder, convicted on evidence that a child can see is planted. And the person who actually killed my husband is going to inherit half of Vale and Cray Importers, free and clear." She leaned forward, and the mink slid off one shoulder, and she didn't bother to fix it. Someone in that company wanted Julian dead, Mr. Wolfe. I don't know who. I don't have proof. What I have is 30 years of knowing my husband's business partner well enough to know he didn't do this, and nobody in this city willing to listen to a widow's instincts over a police inspector's arrest sheet. There was a silence then, the kind Wolfe lets sit, because he knows silence does work that argument can't. I watched him. His eyes had gone to the middle distance, which meant he was no longer looking at Mrs. Vale at all, but at the shape of the problem itself, turning it the way you'd turn a stone to see if there was anything underneath. Vale and Cray, he said finally. Importers of what? Gemstones primarily. Opals, out of Australia. Some sapphire and jade from further east. It was Julian's father's firm originally. Julian inherited it, brought Everett in as a partner in 1906, when they were both young men with more ambition than capital. And the arsenic in the desk drawer. Whose desk? Everett's, in his private office. Convenient, Wolfe said, and I caught the faint curl at the corner of his mouth that in another man would be a smirk, for whoever placed it there. And inconvenient in the extreme for Mr. Cray, which is rather the point of planting evidence, is it not? Who else works at this firm? She straightened slightly, sensing, correctly, that the tide had turned. There's Julian's nephew, Roger Vale, who manages the shipping and inventory. There's Everett's daughter, Miriam, who does the books. And there's a man named Delbert Straw, who's been the firm's gemologist for perhaps 15 years. He authenticates the stones, sets values. And there's Vivian. She paused on the name, and something crossed her face I couldn't quite name. Not quite distaste, not quite fear, something adjacent to both. Vivian Cross, Julian's secretary. She'd been with him 8 years. I take it, Wolfe said, that Vivian Cross is relevant to your hesitation just now. Mrs. Vale's chin came up a fraction. I don't gossip, Mr. Wolfe. Nor do I ask you to. I ask you to answer questions, which is a different exercise entirely, however much the two may resemble each other in casual company. He shifted in his chair, the leather groaning under him in protest. Archie. I already had my notebook out. Yes, sir. Get the particulars from Mrs. Vale, the address of the firm, the arresting officer, the date and manner of Mr. Vale's death, and a full accounting of everyone who had access to the household and the office in the week preceding it. I will want to speak with Mr. Cray's attorney before 4 o'clock, and with Inspector Kramer, if he can be persuaded to be civil, sometime tomorrow. He turned to Mrs. Vale, and something in his manner had shifted, gone from reluctant to merely irritable, which in Wolfe passes for enthusiasm. I make no promises, madam. I may conclude, after inquiry, that Mr. Cray is precisely as guilty as the police believe. But I find the convenience of that desk drawer worth 2 days of my curiosity, and curiosity once engaged is not an expense I can easily decline. She let out a breath that had probably been sitting in her chest since Tuesday. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Wolfe pressed the buzzer for beer, which meant as far as he was concerned, the interview was over, and the real question now was lunch. Thank me when Mr. Cray is a free man and someone else is wearing his handcuffs. Archie will see you out, once he has what he needs. Vale. I got the particulars. The address on Pearl Street, the name of Cray's lawyer, a dry recitation of the facts of Julian Vale's death that made my stomach turn slightly, despite 11 years of practice at not letting it, and saw her to the door. When I came back into the office, Wolfe had his eyes closed and his hands folded over the shelf of his stomach, which either meant he was thinking, or that lunch was 7 minutes away, and he'd rather not discuss the case until he'd eaten. With Wolfe, those two states are frequently identical. A conspiracy of opals, he murmured, without opening his eyes, dressed up as a marriage of convenience gone wrong. Archie, get Mr. Cray's attorney on the telephone, and find out what you can, discreetly, about Miss Vivian Cross. I picked up the phone, already fairly certain that discreetly was going to mean an afternoon of legwork that Wolfe would never in 1,000 years have considered doing himself, and that the mink-stoled widow of Pearl Street had just bought herself a very expensive, very thorough, and very likely uncomfortable education in exactly how far Nero Wolfe's curiosity could reach once it got its teeth into something. Cray's attorney, a nervous, competent man named Simmons, met me at the Tombs at 2 that afternoon, and by 1:30 I'd had 10 minutes with Everett Cray himself, which is more than Kramer's boys had bothered to give him beyond the standard interrogation. He was a tall man gone stooped, with the kind of weathered, honest face that juries like to convict anyway, because honest faces don't sell newspapers. He said he'd been in Boston the day Julian died, meeting a shipper, and he said it like a man repeating something for the 40th time to people who'd stopped listening around the 3rd. I believed him, for what that's worth, which in a court of law is exactly nothing. Vale and Cray importers occupied the 3rd floor of a narrow building on Pearl Street that smelled, even from the stairwell, of cedar shavings and something faintly metallic I couldn't place until I was inside and saw the packing room, raw stone, uncut and unset, sitting in felt-lined trays under glass, like Christmas ornaments waiting for a tree. I told the girl at the front desk I was there on behalf of Mrs. Vale, which was true, and that I had some questions about the estate, which was a lie flexible enough to hold up for an afternoon. Roger Vale came out to see me first, and I understood inside of 90 seconds why Mrs. Vale hadn't mentioned him with any particular warmth. He was maybe 32, built narrow and quick, with the kind of smile that arrives half a second before it's earned, and stays half a second too long after. Julian's brother's son, he told me, and had been running shipping and inventory for 6 years. And wasn't it a damn shame about Uncle Julian? And wasn't it worse that poor old Everett had gotten himself tangled up in it? You don't think he did it, I said. I didn't say that. The smile flickered, adjusted, came back. I said it's a shame. Man builds a business for 40 years, ends up in the Tombs over a bottle of brandy. Whether he did it or not, that's for the police to sort out. I've got a warehouse full of consignments, and half my staff too busy gossiping to load a truck. He looked at his watch, a gesture I've seen enough men make to know when it's genuine impatience and when it's a prop. This one felt like a prop. I was in Trenton the day it happened, if that's what you're circling toward. Inventory audit at the receiving depot. I can give you 6 names who'll swear to it. I hadn't asked, which meant he'd been rehearsing the answer before I'd finished my second question. And a man who rehearses his alibi for a stranger asking about an estate is a man who's spent some time recently thinking hard about alibis. Miriam Cray was a different animal entirely. Everett's daughter, mid-20s, sharp-eyed behind wire spectacles, sitting in a back office, surrounded by ledgers, stacked with the kind of precision that told me she was either naturally tidy or currently terrified and using tidiness to keep her hands busy. She didn't smile at all. My father didn't kill Julian Vale, she said, before I'd gotten my hat off. I've done these books for 4 years, Mr. Goodwin. I know every dollar that's moved through this firm since 1922. My father had no reason on God's earth to want Julian dead. Julian's death doesn't even benefit him the way the police think it does, because the partnership was never going to dissolve any other way. And the insurance, she stopped herself, color rising. The insurance, I said gently, the way you'd coax a cat out from under a porch. The insurance policy is 15 years old, she said. It's a standard key man arrangement, the kind any 2 business partners would carry on each other. It's not evidence of anything, except that they were sensible men. I've told the police this. I've told them twice. Nobody wants to hear arithmetic when they've already decided on a story. I asked her, careful, whether the books had shown anything unusual lately, a shipment that didn't reconcile, a valuation that seemed off. She hesitated exactly long enough for me to notice it, then said no, nothing, and went back to her ledgers with the particular over-attention of someone who wants very badly to stop talking to you. Delbert Straw I found in a small room off the packing floor, hunched over a jeweler's loop with the concentration of a man defusing something. He was somewhere past 60, precise in his movements, precise in his speech, and when I introduced myself, He set the loop down with the care of a surgeon setting down a scalpel, and folded his hands. "Terrible business," he said. "Terrible. Julian Vale had the finest eye for opal I've encountered in 30 years in this trade. Better than mine, and I don't say that about many men. Whoever did this ought to hang for it twice, once for the murder and once for the loss to the trade." He said this with what struck me as genuine feeling. But genuine feeling doesn't rule a man out, any more than an honest face rules out Everett Cray. "You authenticate the stones that come through here?" "Every piece. Weight, clarity, fire, provenance where it can be established. Opal's a tricky business, Mr. Goodwin. More fraud in opal than in almost any stone I know. Because the color's so variable, a skilled man can pass a doublet or a triplet for the genuine article to anyone but another skilled man." He said it with a kind of professional pride that made me file the sentence away without quite knowing why yet. Last was Vivian Cross, and I saved her for last on purpose, because Mrs. Vale's hesitation over the name had stuck a small burr under my saddle. She was handsome in the composed way of women who've learned composure as armor, rather than inheriting it as temperament. Dark-haired, maybe 30, dressed better than a secretary's salary usually allows. She answered my questions in short, complete sentences that gave away nothing and offered nothing extra, which in my experience is its own kind of answer. I typed his correspondence, I kept his calendar, I brought him his coffee, she said when I asked what her duties had involved. 8 years of it. I don't know who killed him, and I'll thank you not to ask me questions the police have already asked, since I gave them the same answers I'll give you, and I don't enjoy giving them twice. Nobody's accused you of anything, Miss Cross? No, she said, and something in the set of her jaw suggested she'd braced herself for it anyway. Nobody has. I left Pearl Street a little after 5, with a notebook full of alibis nobody had verified, and one clear impression, the kind Wolfe would call premature, and I'd call instinct. Every single person in that building had answered my questions a beat too fast or a beat too slow, and nobody, not one of them, had answered like a person with nothing to hide. I got back to the brownstone at 6:10, which put me square in the middle of Wolfe's pre-dinner hour, and found him in the office with a bottle of beer, sweating a ring onto his desk blotter, and a look on his face that told me he'd spent the afternoon on the telephone to more useful effect than I'd spent mine on the pavement. Inspector Kramer, he said, without preamble, was persuaded to share the medical examiner's report, in exchange for my assurance that I would communicate to him promptly anything I learned that bears on Mr. Cray's guilt or innocence. An assurance I intend to honor, Archie, in the spirit, if not the letter. Which means we shall tell him what he needs to know precisely when it suits us, and not one moment before. He picked up a paper from the desk. Julian Vale died of acute arsenic poisoning. The arsenic administered in a glass of brandy, taken after dinner, at approximately 9:15 in the evening. Death occurred some 3 hours later. Mrs. Vale states that she and her husband dined alone that evening. The household staff had been given the night off for a family matter concerning the cook, and that after dinner, Julian retired to his study with his brandy, while she read in the parlor. She heard nothing unusual until nearly midnight, when she went to check on him and found him in evident distress. He died before the physician arrived. So whoever poisoned the brandy did it before 9:15, I said, which means either Mrs. Vale is lying about being alone in that house, or somebody got into the study earlier in the day and doctored the decanter, and it just sat there waiting. The latter, according to the medical examiner, is entirely consistent with the evidence. Arsenic trioxide is tasteless, or very nearly so, in the quantities that would be masked by good brandy, and it need not have been introduced within hours of consumption, days even, provided the decanter was not disturbed. Wolfe took a swallow of beer and set the glass down with the small, precise thud that means he's building toward a point. Which raises the question that Inspector Kramer, in his admirable haste, appears not to have troubled himself with. Who in the days preceding Julian Vale's death had access to that decanter? Mrs. Vale, obviously, the household staff, before their night off, Anybody who visited the house. I flipped my notebook open. And here's the part I like. Everett Cray was in Boston. Has been since the Thursday before. 6 witnesses, according to his own account. And Simmons the lawyer says the same 6 names checked out fine with the district attorney's own investigator, who apparently didn't think that detail worth mentioning to a jury. Wolfe's eyes had gone half shut, the way they do when a thing has started clicking into shape behind them, like tumblers in a lock. So the arsenic that killed Julian Vale was very likely introduced into that decanter by someone with access to the Vale household who was not, in point of fact, in Boston. And yet the arsenic that damns Mr. Vale. Cray was found not in that household, but in a desk drawer on Pearl Street, some considerable distance away. Discovered when precisely? Day after the murder. Kramer's men went to the office to interview the partners and found it in a routine search. Routine. Wolfe made the word sound like an insult, which from him it generally is. Archie, a man clever enough to poison a decanter days in advance, and patient enough to wait for its use, is not a man who then leaves a supply of the same poison in an unlocked drawer for the police to discover the following morning, unless he intends precisely that discovery. It is not evidence of Mr. Cray's guilt. It is evidence of someone's confidence that Mr. Cray would be blamed, and confidence of that particular shape does not arise by accident. It is manufactured. He drained the glass. Tell me about the 4 people you spoke with today, and leave nothing out, including what you thought and did not say. I gave it to him whole. Roger's rehearsed alibi, Miriam's arithmetic, and her half-second of hesitation over the books, Straw's lecture on opal fraud, Vivian Cross's armor. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, and his fingers laced over his stomach, and when I finished, he sat quiet long enough that I thought he'd drifted off, which with Wolfe is always a live possibility around dinner time. Doublets and triplets, he said finally. Come again? Mr. Straw's observation that a skilled man can pass an imitation for the genuine article to anyone but another skilled man. An idle remark, perhaps, or perhaps not. He opened his eyes. Archie, tomorrow I want you to determine 2 things. First, whether Vale and Cray Importers has, in recent months, suffered any dispute or discrepancy regarding the valuation of shipments. A dispute that might explain Miss Cray's hesitation. Second, I want the name and address of whatever firm handles Julian Vale's insurance, and I want to know when precisely that policy was written, and whether it has been altered in any particular since. He pushed back from the desk, which meant dinner, in his internal clock, was no longer a future event, but an imminent one. A man does not plant evidence against his partner out of spite, Archie. He plants it because the truth, examined closely enough, points somewhere he cannot afford to have it point. Our task is not to defend Mr. Cray. It is to discover what the truth would show, were anyone sufficiently patient to look. And if it shows Cray did it after all? Wolfe was already at the door, and he didn't turn around, but I caught the corner of his mouth twitch in that particular way of his. Then Mrs. Vale's retainer will have purchased her a very thorough and very expensive confirmation of the obvious, and I shall regret nothing except the 4 days it cost me. Fritz has done a shad row tonight, Archie, and I do not intend to let it grow cold over speculation that can as easily wait until after the Sabayon. Wolfe does not often invite 4 people to the office in one afternoon. It disrupts the schedule and forces him to skip his 4 o'clock orchid hour, which he regards as roughly equivalent to skipping a meal. But by Thursday morning, he decided the shortest route to the truth ran straight through Pearl Street's staff, and he'd rather have them uncomfortable in his territory than comfortable in their own. Roger Vale came first, at 2, wearing the same half-second late smile he'd shown me in the warehouse, though it dimmed considerably once he got a look at the man behind the desk. Mr. Vale, Wolfe said, once Roger had settled into the red leather chair, with the particular stiffness of a man trying to look relaxed, and failing. You were, I understand, conducting an inventory audit in Trenton on the day your uncle died. That's right. Left on the 7:10, didn't get back till near 8 that night. Half a dozen men can vouch for me. Admirable thoroughness for an alibi, covering a single day's absence. But arsenic, Mr. Vale, is patient. The medical examiner is confident the poison entered your uncle's brandy decanter some days before it was consumed, not hours. Trenton, however diligently documented, establishes nothing regarding your whereabouts the preceding week. Wolfe let that sit a moment, watching the smile falter. When did you last visit your uncle's home? Roger's jaw worked before the answer came out. The Sunday before. Brought him some shipping manifests for his signature. He liked to look them over personally. Always had, even after he'd handed most of the day-to-day to me. I was there maybe 20 minutes. Had a glass of water in the study while he read through the papers, and that was the whole of it. The study in which the brandy decanter was kept. I suppose so. I wasn't paying attention to the furniture, Mr. Wolfe. I was paying attention to getting his signature so I could catch my train. Naturally, Wolfe's tone made the word do more work than its dictionary definition allowed. One further matter. Your cousin, your uncle's business, I should say, dealt substantially in opal. Was there, to your knowledge, any recent dispute concerning the valuation of a shipment? Any discrepancy Mr. Straw or Miss Cray might have raised? For just a second. Less than a second, really. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't specifically hunting for it. Something moved behind Roger's eyes that had nothing to do with grief for his uncle. Then it was gone, and the smile came back online like a lamp on a timer. Nothing I heard about. Straw's a fussy old bird, finds fault with half the stones that come through. It's practically his job description. If there was something, he never brought it to me. He stood before Wolfe had dismissed him, which is its own kind of tell. Is there anything else? I've got a business to run practically single-handed at the moment. Wolfe let him go without another word, which unsettled Roger more, I think, than any further questioning would have. Miriam Cray came at 2:45, and unlike Roger, she sat forward in the chair, hands folded, the posture of someone determined to be useful. You hesitated, Mr. Goodwin tells me, Wolfe said, when he asked whether the books had shown anything unusual lately. She flushed, but didn't look away. I didn't want to say anything without proof. It felt like grasping at anything to save my father. And I didn't want to be that kind of witness. She took a breath. There were 3 shipments in the last 4 months where the invoice value didn't match what I'd have expected, given the weights and grades Mr. Straw recorded. Not wildly off, just off. A few $100s here, a little more there. I mentioned it to Julian once, in passing, maybe 6 weeks ago. He said he'd look into it himself. Did he report back to you? No. But he started asking Vivian for the shipment files going back further. Records from Roger's department mostly. I thought it was odd he'd go through Vivian rather than ask me directly, since I keep the books. But Julian was particular about who he involved in things until he was sure of them. And you did not think to mention this to the police? Her chin lifted. I mentioned the discrepancies. I didn't accuse Roger of anything, because I don't have proof he did anything, and my father is the one sitting in a cell, Mr. Wolfe, not Roger. I wasn't going to hand the police a second theory to chase while the first one has my father's name on it. I wanted them looking at facts, not family suspicions. It was, I thought, a genuinely decent instinct badly applied, and Wolfe seemed to think something similar, because his voice gentled by a degree I don't often hear him use. Your discretion has cost several days, Miss Cray, but I understand it. You may yet have the chance to be more useful than the police, which I suspect, on reflection, you would prefer. Straw at 3:15 needed no prompting at all. He'd apparently spent the intervening days turning the matter over in his own methodical mind, and once seated, he delivered it like a man reading minutes into the record. I flagged 3 shipments to Julian personally over this past spring and summer, he said. Nothing I could swear to under oath. Variances within the ordinary margin of a valuation dispute. The sort of thing that happens in this trade more than laymen would credit. But 3 in 4 months, all from the same receiving lot, all slightly light of what the paperwork claimed, that troubled me. I told Julian I couldn't rule out an honest error in grading. He thanked me and asked me to say nothing further to anyone until he'd had a chance to look into it himself. Did he indicate to whom his inquiry pointed? But I'll tell you what I told the police, for what little they cared to hear it. Opal fraud in this trade nearly always involves substitution. A doublet or triplet passed off as solid stone in the paperwork. The genuine article quietly sold elsewhere at full value, and the difference pocketed. It requires access to the shipment before it's logged and graded. Not everyone in that building has that access, Mr. Wolfe. Very few people do. Who does? Straw's mouth tightened. The man who receives and logs the shipments before I ever see them. That would be Mr. Roger Vale. Vivian Cross came last, at 4, and sat through the first several questions with the same clipped closed answers she'd given me on Pearl Street. Until Wolfe, who has a gift for locating precisely the wrong thing to say that turns out to be exactly the right thing, asked her, mildly, whether Julian Vale had ever asked her to compile shipment records without informing anyone else in the office. Her composure didn't crack so much as quietly give way, like ice under weight rather than a hammer. He asked me in July, she said, to pull every receiving log from Roger's department for the past year and bring them to him at home, not the office. He said he didn't want it discussed with anyone, including Miriam, until he understood what he was looking at. I didn't ask why. I did what he asked. I brought him the last of it, her voice caught, just slightly, the Friday before he died. And you said nothing of this to the police? I said nothing of this to anyone, Mr. Wolfe, because I was frightened. If Julian was killed over whatever was in those records, and I'm the one who fetched them for him, that doesn't make me look innocent. It makes me look like the last person who knew exactly what he'd found. She met his eyes for the first time all afternoon, steady despite the tremor in her voice. I cared about Julian Vale. Vale apparently suspects. Whatever she's implied to you. I typed his letters and kept his secrets when he asked me to. And now he's dead. And I've spent a week terrified that keeping that particular secret is going to look exactly like a motive. Wolfe regarded her for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had none of its usual dry irony in it. Miss Cross, a secret kept out of loyalty and a secret kept out of guilt wear very different faces, and yours, I think, is the former. You will feel considerably better once the actual guilty face has been identified. Archie will see you out. When the door closed behind her, Wolfe sat with his eyes shut for a good 30 seconds before he spoke again. Trenton, Archie, he said, tomorrow. I want to know precisely what hours Mr. Vale can account for, and precisely what hours he cannot. Trenton on a Friday morning is not anybody's idea of a good time, but I caught the 8:15 and was at the receiving depot by 9:30, where I found the foreman, a broad, unhurried man named Cassidy, who chewed a toothpick like it owed him money, and answered questions about as fast as he moved, which was not fast. Sure, Vale was here, he said, when I'd explained myself and slipped him a 5 for his trouble. Audit day. He come in, he squinted, working it out. Must have been near 1 o'clock, 1:30. Stayed till we knocked off around 6. Not the 7:10 from Penn Station? He told the police he left New York at 7:10 in the morning. Cassidy shrugged, unbothered by the discrepancy, in a way that told me he hadn't been asked the question with any precision before. Alls I know is I didn't see him till 1. Could have been here earlier and off somewhere else. I wasn't watching the gate. But the audit itself, the actual counting and checking, that was afternoon into evening. 6 of us signed the sheet, and every one of us'll tell you the same, afternoon, which left a hole of some 5 or 6 hours, from a 7:10 departure that put him in Trenton before 9, to a 1 o'clock appearance at the depot, and a man doesn't need much more than a round trip on the fast train to get back into New York and out again, if he's motivated enough. And by my reckoning, a man protecting a fraud scheme, and as it turned out, a good deal more than that, is about as motivated as they come. I checked the timetables at the station myself. An express could have him back in Manhattan by 10, and back to Trenton in time for a 1 o'clock appearance, with 2 hours to spare for whatever business he'd needed to conduct. It wasn't proof he'd done it. It was proof his alibi had a hole in it wide enough to drive that same express train through. And no district attorney's investigator had apparently bothered to check the timetable, because why would they, when they already had a desk drawer and an insurance policy pointing at a man already behind bars? The second stop was the law firm of Detweiler and Fenn, who I found listed on the partnership agreement's old letterhead among the papers Miriam had given me, and where a junior partner named Fenn, once I'd made clear I was there on behalf of Mrs. Vale and not the district attorney, was cooperative in the particular way of lawyers who like the sound of their own explanations. The original partnership agreement, 1906, was a simple document, he said, pulling a folder thick with amendments, but it was revised substantially in 1924, when Julian and Everett formalized succession provisions, standard practice by then, given the sums involved. The key clause states that upon the death of either partner, the surviving partner assumes full control, provided he remains capable of doing so. Should the surviving partner be rendered incapable by death, incapacitation, or, and I quote the language here, conviction of a felony rendering continued service in a fiduciary capacity untenable, management and controlling interest pass to the deceased partner's next of kin, which in Julian Vale's case would be his only surviving nephew, and named specifically in the 1924 amendment as successor, should the contingency arise. Fenn looked up from the document, and something in my face must have told him what I was thinking, because he added, unprompted, "It's an unusual clause, I'll grant you." Julian insisted on it at the time, wanted to be sure the firm his father built would stay in family hands under any circumstance. I don't imagine he considered the circumstance in question would be quite this literal. I thanked him, took a copy of the relevant page, and caught the 4:40 back to the city, with my head working through the arithmetic the whole way. Julian Vale dead, Everett Cray convicted, and by the terms of that clause, rendered incapable in exactly the language the lawyers had written, which left Roger Vale, warehouse manager, nephew, a man with unsupervised access to every shipment before Delbert Straw ever laid eyes on it, a man with a hole in his alibi wide enough for a train to pass through, and a man who stood, by the plainest reading of a document written 11 years before anyone had reason to think it would matter, to inherit sole controlling interest in Vale and Cray Importers, the moment a jury did what the district attorney was already confident it would do. I got back to the brownstone at 7, found Wolfe at his desk with the last of his second beer, and laid the whole of it out, Cassidy's toothpick and the timetable's haul, Fenn's folder and the 1924 clause, and watched something settle into place behind Wolfe's eyes that I'd learned, over 11 years, to recognize as the sound of a lock finally accepting its key. Fraud to fund the difference, he said slowly, half to himself, half to me, detected by a man with the finest eye in the trade, who then spent his last weeks quietly gathering the proof through a secretary he trusted, precisely because she had no reason to suspect where it led, and a contingency clause, written by a doting uncle to keep his father's business in blood, that turned into the tidiest motive I have encountered in some years. He set the glass down. "Get Saul Panzer on the telephone, Archie. I want to know everything obtainable, discreetly, about any sale of unset opal stones in this city over the past 6 months. Private sales, not through the ordinary trade channels. And then, get some sleep. Tomorrow I intend to think. And I would rather you were rested enough to keep pace when I finish. Saul Panzer is the best operative in New York for work that requires a man to be invisible while asking questions loud enough to get answered. And by Saturday evening, he'd turned up exactly what Wolfe wanted. 3 private sales of unset opal, cash transactions through a discreet dealer on West 47th Street, who didn't ask many questions of sellers who didn't ask many of him. Each sale within a week or two of one of the 3 shipments Straw had flagged as light. The seller, according to the dealer's ledger, which Saul had persuaded him to consult, under circumstances I didn't ask too closely about, had signed simply RV. Wolfe received this news at his desk Sunday morning with the particular satisfaction of a man watching the last piece of a jigsaw settle into a picture he'd already guessed at. And then he did what he always does at that stage of a case, which is sit very still with his eyes shut for the better part of an hour, while I sat across from him doing the crossword and trying not to disturb the machinery. "The shape of it, Archie," he said finally, without opening his eyes, "is this. Roger Vale has for some months been substituting inferior composite stones, doublets, triplets, whatever passed muster to an untrained eye and an incomplete inspection, for genuine opal in a portion of the shipments passing through his hands, selling the genuine stones privately and pocketing the difference. A modest fraud, as such things go, and one that might have continued indefinitely had Julian Vale not possessed, by Mr. Straw's own testimony, the finest eye for opal in the trade. Julian noticed the discrepancies Miss Cray had also noticed. He said nothing to his nephew, nothing to his partner, nothing even to his own bookkeeper beyond a passing mention. Instead, he quietly, methodically gathered proof through a secretary he trusted to keep her own counsel. And Roger found out he was being investigated. Undoubtedly, and likely from Julian himself, who was not, from everything we have heard of him, a man inclined to confront an employee, even a nephew, without first affording him the opportunity to explain himself. I would guess Julian raised the matter directly, perhaps during that Sunday visit ostensibly concerning shipping manifests, and gave his nephew some manner of ultimatum. Roger, recognizing that exposure meant not merely disgrace, but very likely prosecution, and recognizing further, for he is not a stupid man, whatever else he may be, that his uncle's death, timed correctly, would remove both the man who had discovered his fraud and through the mechanism of that unfortunate 1924 clause, the partner who might otherwise have continued pursuing it in his uncle's stead, made his decision. He had access to that decanter during his visit. Arsenic requires no great cunning to procure or administer, only patience, and patience Mr. Vale evidently possesses in adequate supply. And the desk drawer? An elegant refinement, and I confess it is the detail that most firmly convinces me of the whole. Roger Vale required not merely his uncle's silence, but his partner's removal as well, for so long as Everett Cray remained free and in control of the firm, the fraud investigation Julian had begun might yet be completed by another hand, and the succession clause would never come into play at all. By planting arsenic in a desk, to which he, as a man moving freely through every office in that building on ordinary business, had easy access, he accomplished two objects with a single stroke. He directed police suspicion away from himself entirely, and he ensured that Everett Cray's conviction would trigger precisely the clause that delivers control of Vale and Cray importers into his own hands. That's a tidy theory, I said. It's also entirely circumstantial. A hole in an alibi, some private sales signed with initials that could belong to half the RVs in Manhattan, and a motive clause 11 years old. Kramer would laugh you out of his office. Which is precisely why, Wolfe said, opening his eyes at last, we shall not present it to Inspector Kramer until Mr. Vale has been persuaded to remove the necessity of laughter. Archie, I want you to telephone Mr. Vale tomorrow morning. Tell him Mrs. Vale has requested, through this office, a full accounting of certain estate matters relating to opal inventory currently held by the firm. Straw has been engaged to examine in my presence a specific parcel of stones recovered from among Julian Vale's personal effects. Stones which Julian, we shall say, had set aside shortly before his death, apparently for some purpose of his own. Tell him his presence is requested, as the firm's inventory manager, to verify the parcel's provenance against the shipping records. There isn't any parcel, I said. There will be by Tuesday afternoon, once Mr. Straw and I have selected something suitably genuine-looking from his own stock to present as recovered evidence. A man innocent of substitution fraud will examine such a parcel with mild professional interest and nothing more. A man who has spent months replacing genuine opal with doublets, and who has convinced himself his uncle died before completing his investigation, will examine it very differently indeed, because he will not know, until the moment Mr. Straw's loop is on the stones, whether his uncle left behind proof that reaches beyond the grave to indict him. Wolfe pushed back from the desk. It is not a kind thing to do to a man, Archie, but neither was arsenic in a brandy decanter, and I find my sympathy for Mr. Vale's discomfort considerably diminished by that fact. Tuesday afternoon we had the office arranged the way Wolfe likes it arranged, when he means to watch a man closely without appearing to. Straw at the small table by the globe, with a black velvet cloth, and his jeweler's loop laid out like a surgeon's instruments. Myself at my desk with a stenographer's pad I had no intention of using for anything but appearances, and Wolfe behind his own desk with a glass of beer he hadn't touched, which told me more than anything else in the room how closely he intended to pay attention. Roger Vale arrived at 3, and I noted, watching him cross to the red leather chair, that some of the loose-limbed ease from our first meeting had gone out of him. A week in a business without his uncle to answer to, and a partner in the Tombs, will do that to a man, I told myself, and left it there, because that was exactly the kind of ordinary explanation his behavior deserved on its face. Vale's people said something about a parcel, he said, sitting, recovered from Uncle Julian's effects. I don't understand what there is to verify. If it's opal from our stock, it'll match our records or it won't, and either way, I don't see why it needs the 3 of us in a room. A reasonable question, Wolfe said, and I shall answer it with a reasonable explanation. Your uncle, in the weeks before his death, apparently set aside a small parcel of stones for reasons he did not record. Mrs. Vale found it among his private papers at home, not at the office, wrapped and labeled only with a shipment date. She has asked, quite naturally, whether it represents an unrecorded personal purchase, a gift he intended for someone, or stock that should properly be returned to the firm's inventory. Mr. Straw will examine the stones. You, as the man who oversees receiving and shipping records, are here to confirm or deny whether they correspond to any documented lot. He nodded to Straw. Proceed. Straw unwrapped the velvet cloth with the unhurried ceremony of a man who has done this 10,000 times and never once hurried it, and laid out perhaps a dozen unset opals, all of them, as it happened, entirely genuine, drawn from Straw's own private collection, and selected the day before for their resemblance, general size, general fire, to the sort of stock that had passed through Vale and Cray's receiving room over the preceding months. He took up his loop and bent over the first stone. I was watching Roger Vale and nothing else, the way Wolfe had told me to, and I saw the thing happen that Wolfe had been fishing for. It wasn't dramatic. Roger didn't go pale, didn't bolt, didn't do any of the things a lesser writer of detective stories would have had him do. What he did was go very, very still, the particular stillness of a man holding his own breathing under conscious control, and his eyes fixed on Straw's hands, with an intensity that had nothing to do with idle curiosity about a dead uncle's personal effects. His fingers, resting on the arm of the chair, had gone white at the knuckle. Straw examined the third stone, held it to the light, turned it, and said in the mild, unhurried tone of a man discussing the weather, "This is a fine specimen, genuine, of course, and matched in fire to lot 114, received in June. I recall grading this particular parcel myself." He set it down and reached for the 4th. "Lot 114, Roger said. His voice had lost its usual easy register. It came out half a step higher than he'd intended, and I watched him hear it, and try, too late, to pull it back down. I'd have to check the ledger to be sure which shipment that corresponds to." "There's no need," Wolfe said pleasantly. "Mr. Straw has an excellent memory for his own gradings, and the ledger, I am confident, will confirm precisely what he recalls. The stones are genuine, unremarkable, and entirely consistent with the firm's ordinary stock. Whatever purpose your uncle had for setting them aside, it does not appear to have been fraud." He let the words sit in the air, a moment longer than the sentence required. Watching Roger's face with the flat, patient attention of a man who has just dropped a stone down a well and is listening for the splash. Which is, I confess, something of a relief, given the rumors that have lately reached me regarding certain discrepancies in the firm's shipments over recent months. You will have heard those rumors yourself, Mr. Vale, working as closely with inventory as you do. I've heard. Roger stopped, started again, and this time didn't manage to keep the crack out of his voice at all. I've heard there were some questions about grading variances. Straw would know better than I would. It's not really my department, the valuation side of things. No, Wolfe agreed. Your department is receiving, which is, as it happens, the point in the chain where genuine stone might most easily be exchanged for a composite of lesser value, before Mr. Straw ever lays eyes on it for grading. A man in your position would be uniquely situated to manage such an exchange, should he be so inclined. And uniquely situated, too, to understand precisely how devastating it would be were his uncle to have discovered it before his death, and to have spent his final weeks quietly compiling the proof. The silence that followed was the longest I've sat through in that office in a good long while. Roger Vale sat with his hands gripping the chair arms, his eyes moving from Wolfe to Straw to the stones on the velvet cloth, and back to Wolfe, and I watched a man doing frantic arithmetic behind a face that had entirely stopped pretending to be relaxed. I don't know what you're implying, he said finally, but I'd like to leave now. You may, Wolfe said, though I would advise you to consider, on your way out, precisely how thin the line has grown between what I have implied and what I intend to prove. Good afternoon, Mr. Vale. I expect we shall speak again very shortly, under rather less comfortable circumstances than these. Roger left without another word, moving fast enough that he nearly collided with the doorframe, and once the front door had shut behind him, Wolfe let out a long breath and reached, at last, for his neglected beer. He knows, Straw said quietly, still looking down at his genuine, unremarkable stones. God help him, he knows we know. He has known since the moment I mentioned Lot 114, Wolfe said. A man who has spent months meticulously falsifying receiving records does not forget a lot number when he hears it spoken aloud by a stranger who has no earthly business knowing it. Archie, telephone Inspector Kramer. Tell him I require his presence here tomorrow evening, along with Mr. and Mrs. Cray's attorney, Miss Cray, Miss Cross, and Mrs. Vale. I believe we have imposed on Mr. Straw's generosity and Mr. Vale's nerves quite sufficiently for one afternoon, and it is time to finish the matter properly. Kramer came reluctantly the way he always does, standing by the bookshelves, with his hat still on and his cigar unlit because Wolfe won't have it lit in the office, and looking like a man who expects to be irritated and is rarely disappointed in that expectation. Simmons brought Everett Cray himself. Out on a bail, Wolfe had spent a good part of Wednesday morning arranging through channels I didn't ask too closely about. Mrs. Vale sat in the chair nearest the door, still in black, her hands folded with a stillness that hadn't been there the week before. Miriam Cray sat beside her father, with her hand on his arm. Vivian Cross sat a little apart from everyone, composed again, though I noticed she kept glancing at the door, as if measuring the distance to it. Roger Vale came last, escorted, there's no other word for it, by two of Kramer's men, at Wolfe's specific request, on the theory, which turned out to be entirely correct, that Roger Vale, invited to a gathering of the people he'd wronged, would not have come voluntarily at all. Wolfe waited until everyone was settled, rang for beer, and surveyed the room with the particular satisfaction of a man about to do the one piece of physical exertion he genuinely enjoys, which is talking at length while everyone else sits still and listens. "Inspector," he said, "you have arrested the wrong man, on evidence that was manufactured for the specific purpose of ensuring you would arrest him. I intend in the next 20 minutes to demonstrate this beyond any reasonable dispute, and to identify for you the man who actually murdered Julian Vale, and why? Kramer's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt, which from Kramer is its own kind of tribute to Wolfe's track record. The motive begins, Wolfe continued, with a fraud. For some months, shipments of opal passing through the receiving department of Vale and Cray importers were quietly altered. Genuine stone replaced with composite doublets and triplets of considerably lesser value. The genuine articles sold privately for cash through a dealer on West 47th Street. Mr. Straw's professional eye flagged 3 such shipments as anomalous. Miss Cray's ledgers independently showed the same 3 shipments as financially inconsistent. Neither discovery alone was conclusive. Together, and in the hands of a man with Julian Vale's exceptional eye for opal, they were. He turned his head fractionally toward Roger, who sat rigid between Kramer's 2 men, staring at the carpet. Julian Vale investigated quietly, through his secretary, Miss Cross, whom he trusted to gather shipping records, without alerting the one person those records would implicate, his own nephew, who managed receiving, and who had, as it happens, sole practical access to alter genuine stone for composite before it ever reached Mr. Straw's grading table. "This is speculation," Roger said, but his voice had none of the conviction the words required. "It was speculation," Wolfe agreed, "until yesterday afternoon, when Mr. Straw presented you with a parcel of stones I represented as recovered from your uncle's private papers, labeled with a shipment lot number I invented for the occasion. You did not ask which lot. You did not need to. Your reaction, Inspector, was witnessed by myself, by Mr. Goodwin, and by Mr. Straw, and I dare say a man innocent of fraud does not go the color of old parchment at the mere mention of a fictitious lot number." Kramer's eyes had moved to Roger, and stayed there. Confronted by his uncle, likely during a visit ostensibly concerning shipping manifests, the Sunday before Julian Vale's death, Roger Vale understood that exposure meant not merely disgrace, but very probably criminal prosecution for fraud on a scale sufficient to end both his career and his liberty. He made his decision that same visit, I believe, or very shortly after. He had access, during that call, to the study in which the brandy decanter stood. Arsenic requires no particular skill to procure or administer, only the patience to wait, which he possessed, since the poison was not consumed for several days after it was introduced. "You have no proof of when he introduced anything," Simmons said, though it was clear from his tone he was asking on behalf of a client he already believed innocent, not challenging Wolfe's logic on principle. "I have this," Wolfe said, which Inspector Kramer's own men, had they inquired with the diligence the matter deserved, would have discovered themselves. "Mr. Vale's alibi for the day of the murder places him in Trenton, conducting an inventory audit, from approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon onward, a fact confirmed by 6 witnesses, all entirely reliable. What none of those witnesses can confirm, and what Mr. Vale's own account to the police conveniently glossed over, is his whereabouts between a 7:10 departure from Penn Station and his 1 o'clock appearance at the Trenton receiving depot. A gap of nearly 6 hours, ample time for a return trip to Manhattan and back by express train, with time to spare." Wolfe paused, and I could see Kramer doing the arithmetic himself, the particular unhappy arithmetic of a man realizing his own investigators had missed something. Archie Goodwin had turned up with a train timetable and an afternoon's legwork. That gap, Inspector, was never explained, because no one troubled to ask him to explain it. I invite you to ask him now. His silence, in that room, was answer enough for everyone in it. And I watched Kramer's face settle into the particular grim satisfaction of a cop who has just realized he's about to get to make a second arrest instead of admitting to a first mistake, which suited him considerably better than the alternative. "The desk drawer," Wolfe went on, relentless now, "was the final and, I confess, the most elegant piece of the scheme. Mr. Vale required not merely his uncle's silence, but Everett Cray's removal as well. For so long as Mr. Cray remained free to run the firm, the fraud investigation his uncle had begun might yet be completed by another hand. And more critically, control of Vale and Cray importers would remain with Mr. Cray rather than passing to Mr. Vale. The 1924 Partnership Amendment, which several people in this room have now confirmed to me, specifies that should the surviving partner be rendered incapable through conviction of a felony, controlling interest passes directly to Julian Vale's next of kin, his nephew, Roger. By planting arsenic in a drawer to which he, moving freely through the office on ordinary business, had easy and unremarkable access, Mr. Vale accomplished two objects with a single stroke. He directed suspicion entirely away from himself, and he ensured that Mr. Cray's conviction would trigger precisely the clause delivering the firm into his own hands. 2 birds, Inspector, and a single stone. Though I note with some irony that the stone in question was in the end no more genuine than the opals he'd been selling. There was a long silence, and then Everett Cray, who had sat through the whole of it without a word, said quietly, "Roger, for God's sake, I toasted your uncle's health at my own table 2 nights before he died." Roger didn't answer him either, and Kramer, apparently deciding the room had heard enough for one evening, nodded to his men, and they took Roger Vale out through the front door under considerably less dignified circumstances than he'd walked in through a week and a half earlier, believing himself about to inherit a business built by men considerably better than himself. The room emptied out slowly after that, Kramer staying long enough to extract a promise from Wolfe of a full written statement, which Wolfe gave with the visible reluctance of a man being asked to do arithmetic. Simmons already murmuring to Cray about the paperwork required to formally clear his name. Miriam Cray crying, finally, the kind of crying that happens after a person has held it together for exactly as long as they had to, and not 1 minute more. Vivian Cross paused at the door and said something to Wolfe I didn't quite catch, and whatever it was the first time all week I'd seen something like a genuine smile cross her face. Mrs. Vale was the last to leave, and she stopped in front of Wolfe's desk and simply said, "Thank you," in a voice that had finally stopped sounding like it was reciting something rehearsed. "Thank Mr. Goodwin's talent for train timetables," Wolfe said, "and Mr. Straw's talent for Opal. I merely arranged the furniture." Once the door had shut behind the last of them, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the particular sigh of a man who has spent an entire evening talking instead of eating, and fully intends to remedy the imbalance as soon as humanly possible. "Well," I said, capping my pen, "that's 4 days' work, and a dead uncle solved, 1 wrongly accused partner sprung, and a nephew who's going to have a great deal of time in a cell to reflect on the fact that honest opal was worth considerably more to him, in the long run, than the composite kind." "An observation," Wolfe said, "with the particular virtue of being true and entirely useless to him now. I believe, Archie, we have earned the sabayon we were denied on Monday, and I intend to enjoy it without a single further thought given to gemstones, inventory clauses, or trains to Trenton for the remainder of the evening." I told him that suited me fine, and it did. Though I'll admit that for a few days afterward, whenever anybody offered me a glass of anything, I checked it a little more carefully than usual before I drank it. Call it professional habit. In this business, you learn that the most dangerous things rarely announce themselves, and the cleverest men are the ones patient enough to let a lie sit quietly in a drawer or a decanter for exactly as long as it takes somebody to stop looking.